The Business Simplicity Podcast, where leaders share their most successful strategies and the failures that inspired them, so business owners and managers can avoid the suffering and reap the benefits. With your host, Chris Parker.
And welcome to the Business Simplicity Podcast. This is Chris Parker, and I am having a conversation with Karim Benammar, who is a philosopher and an author, amongst other things, gives workshops. I was introduced to the thinking of Karim through Simon Broad, who's been on the podcast at least twice that I can think of. And we used his methods or his insights about reframing thinking about a certain topic. And we actually embedded that in a workshop we gave, a series of workshops around sustainability. And how it, the way it unlocked a group of people's minds that things were actually achievable that they had thought perhaps impossible was profound. And I'll put in the show notes maybe the link to that because you can hear it from the client of that Van Ord. Great stuff. And while preparing for this, I've also been enjoying his podcast, Cornucopia, which is on Apple Podcasts and Google and other places. So although it might sound weird, I would actually recommend just pressing pause right now, jump over there, listen to those. I think there's like 5 or 6 episodes there about abundance. And that is also, I would say, mind shifting. And so I'm completely open for this conversation to have further mind shifting moments. So Karim, welcome. Can you maybe take it from there and like we like to say, in the briefest way possible, explain what do you do?
Oh, Chris, well, thank you for this, fantastic introduction. It's wonderful at the beginning of a podcast to point people to another podcast so they can listen to an hour and a half of me rambling on about things. Well, I'm a philosopher, and I use that word a bit more now. I was trained as an academic philosopher. I studied in different countries, England, America, Japan. I was a teacher at university, trying to explain Western philosophy to Japanese people, in fact, which was quite a task, quite a challenge. But 20 years ago, I got involved in a project with the United Nations, which was about global ethos and the possibilities for the next millennium, around the year 2000. And for the first time, I realized that we can actually use thinking in our daily lives and to change the world and to change our future, to shape our future. And until then, philosophy had been a kind of fairly arcane, fascinating thing, but with a very small audience, with a very specific jargon and things like that. So I suppose over the last 20 years, I've been trying to take some of the key ideas in philosophy and to see how they could be applied to business, how they could be applied to people's personal lives, how we can apply them globally to shape the future that matters to us. And within all that broad philosophy, there is a very specific thing that philosophers do, is to ask, why is the world the way it is now? How did it get to be this way? Because it could have gone lots of different directions. And when you ask that question, you start looking for assumptions. You start looking for ideas that we have, which drive our thinking, which drive our action, and which have made the world the way it is today. And the really cool trick is that we can change these assumptions. We can play with them. We can imagine different worlds, and we can put different worlds into practice. And so it's not a very short explanation, but that's how I drifted from being an academic philosopher to now working mostly with organizations, whether they're business organizations or NGOs or government organizations.
There's so much there. And I think we're going to get into some how to apply some of this, but the impact. So philosophy can be quite, I guess, I don't know, I want to say it was surreal. You probably know better words than I, but intangible. And you were working with United Nations and working with organizations. How would you describe the impact or some examples of benefit or big steps that have happened through this looking at things through a philosophical lens?
That's a very good question. I think the impact, one of the things that surprises me more and more, I mean, for the last 10 or 12 years, I've been working with the specific reframing that you mentioned. Reframe is just becoming aware of the current frame that you have, the current assumptions, the current structures, and then forcing yourself to change it and to look at things from a new perspective. And we use that language a lot. We say, think outside the box. We do brainstorms and everything like that. So we see the need to get a fresh perspective, look with new eyes. But I think we tend to do this in our comfort zone. We tend to think, well, it just means a small shift. And I think often it means really deeply questioning deeply held beliefs and firmly held beliefs, and it's uncomfortable. So I think to be really creative, to really change, it's going to be uncomfortable. And so some of the more productive and some of the more I think effective sessions I've had with NGOs or companies have been about making them quite uncomfortable about the status quo and quite uncomfortable about the things that were at the basis or fundamental to their thinking. And you think, why would you want to go through that? That sounds like masochism, to get somebody to make you doubt the things that you built your company or your business model on. But often, there's something wrong with the business model, or it isn't working the way it used to work before, or it isn't as effective as you want it to be. And so if you're willing to make a really fundamental change, you can suddenly, it changes a lot. It gives you, it may save you an enormous amount of time. It may change the relationship, the dynamic with your customers or with your stakeholders quite dramatically. It may shift the culture of a company. So perhaps we could talk about specific examples. I mean, if you talk about the culture of a company or the way we work, especially, I mean, you and I both live in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, people are very busy. In America, people are very busy. I think all over Europe, at least Northern Europe, people are very busy. We see work as people work hard. People don't really work the hours that they get paid. They work in the evenings, they work at the weekends. There's a lot of overtime that people do, especially in the kind of higher positions. And people think that's normal, and they're quite proud of it. And a lot of the system of rewards is based on showing that you're very committed and staying late at the office or putting in the extra time. And there is a whole belief system there that you can unpack, because you think this is normal, but it didn't always used to be that way. There was a time when working less was seen as positive. The upper classes didn't work at all. Working was for the plebs, and so people weren't proud of working. And so this has shifted to being intensely proud of doing work and doing overtime. And that can be a whole culture of a company. And the results is that people get exhausted, that you have burnouts, that people confuse being active and doing a lot of stuff with actually being effective. And that's what I like about your work. This idea of simplicity. You can build up organizations, and especially companies are very good at this, is making the thing very complicated and adding all these layers of control and checking and things like that. And then at some point, it becomes all about that. Somehow the core business that they used to do is almost forgotten. And they can afford to do that because the core business is working automatically. They're so good at it. It makes so much profit that they can afford to build this whole structure of things, which is mostly unnecessary. I would say, I say in my lectures that 50% of what people do in companies is completely unnecessary. There's that wonderful idea of bullshit jobs by David Graeber, that the whole job that you're doing is completely unnecessary and the world would be much better off without you doing that job or that job existing. And it's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. But I think that most of us do 50% bullshit activities. And so when you ask about what's the effect of thinking about the deep assumptions, is that it clears a lot of that misunderstanding. It shows you that there's a lot of constructions which are a form of hot air or a form of belief, but there's no real justification for doing any of those activities.
You mentioned profitability in there, and I'm curious. We're going down a rabbit hole now. By the way, let's go there, and then we'll come back to some tactics. But what I've observed in my sort of reflections on this is the disciplined pursuit of simplicity can be much more difficult in a high margin organization, because it allows laziness, it allows opinion, and it allows an opinion without governance or structure to reconcile those tensions. And then you get layer on layer on layer, because everyone's doing what they believe. As opposed to, I've recently worked with a fashion brand, a women's shoe company that has extremely tight margins, and they had very little room to have bullshit jobs. In fact, they were missing some key capabilities, because it's still a relatively small company, and therefore that they were finding other problems, because they didn't have the whole thing structured enough to actually apply some solutioning and solution thinking to the thing. Is it context, do you think, as well, or what do you think is drives these bullshit jobs?
No, I totally agree with you. I used to, when I worked at universities, I used to think it was very wasteful. And there's this idea that, government expenditure, everything that gets paid by taxes is wasteful because it's somebody else's money. And I thought that too. I thought, we academics do kind of unnecessary things and it's wasteful. Until I started working with businesses. And then I realized, they make so much money, they can afford to be so much more wasteful. They can afford whole positions, whole divisions, which don't do very much, but take themselves very seriously. And so what? If your main product is selling sugar water, and with a little color, you put a little caffeine in or whatever, and then you sell, you have markups of 95% or 98%. Good. Anything addictive that you sell to the world, there'll be a market for it. So there are some products which, sell themselves until they don't, of course, until you get a serious disruption to the market or a real competitor. But there is it's good. We'll come back to the scarcity and abundance argument, but my idea of abundance is that, making value, creating wealth, creating a good life for all of us is not actually that complicated. We're hardwired to do it. We're creative. We like to build things. We have excess capacity. So you'd imagine that businesses would do that. When you talk about small startups or scale-ups or people who are trying to get into a market where there is small margins, I think you're right. The situation is very different. If I backtrack just a second, as a philosopher, as a complete outsider, I'm fascinated by the difference in margins between different fields. You have the kind of luxury good brands, which the markup is huge. You have the same thing in soft drinks and things like that. And then you have others, for example, airlines are famous for, having very, very cutthroat margin, the automobile industry. And you think, why are people doing this to themselves? Why have they created a world where they have to have, say, 50 billion turnover to make 200 million? Whereas you have now these kind of, which used to be startup companies, there's a few based in the Netherlands, the internet payment companies, I think we can mention names, so Adyen or Molly or something like that. They they have a couple of hundred people there, and they're worth 40 billion or something like that. That's the exact opposite. With a tiny bit of work, you can create enormous value, and you can have thousands of planes and tens of thousands of employees, and your margins are so small that if anything goes wrong, there is a bad weather or there's a pandemic. Pandemic, of course, throws the whole thing into disarray. But you have it's very easy to have a bad year because there's no slack. There is no slack in that. And if we go to what are the assumptions beneath there, one of the assumptions that always comes up is that we think that the consumer or the customer wants the cheapest product. Many people compete on price because they're somehow convinced the deep assumption is if we're cheaper, people will buy it. People want to buy cheap stuff. And I think that assumption is not incorrect, but it's not correct all the time. It's correct for a specific subset of everybody's expenditure. So you and I, probably the stuff that we don't particularly care about, we are perfectly happy buying the cheapest thing around. But there's other stuff that we do care about, or that we're fascinated by, or that is our kind of expenditure, that we actually enjoy buying the really expensive stuff or the really high quality stuff. And that relationship with the product has to do with our engagement with it. And if you made it cheaper, we would be disappointed. and some companies are very good at doing this. And so if you're a startup company, I think one of the assumptions that they have is we must compete on price. I would say you probably can't compete on price against the larger companies. So don't actually make your stuff exclusive, make it expensive. And then you want to just increase the margin dramatically. And then you have more opportunities within that company. People make mistakes between profitability and turnover and margins. And again, this is especially true of certain groups. I've worked with architects, and I love architects. They're wonderful people, but they're so hopeless at business decisions. They say, how do we price something? Well, they say, well, this has cost these many hours of our work. And so we'll make an estimate, and then we'll count the hours, and then we'll add 10%. And if they're really sure of themselves, they'll add 15%. And then the problems start because they've miscalculated the hours. Everybody has to put in twice as many hours because they were too ambitious or too optimistic. And then there's other complications. And then because sometimes they pitch and they lose the thing. So in the end, they kind of more or less break even by working 60 to 70 hours a week. And you think, why not? They're all prestige. A lot of these are prestige objects. Why not make it more expensive? Why not make it a percentage of the sale of the building or something like that? And it's just outside of their frame. They just say, well, no, we can't do that. That's not how architects work. And you say, but do you know anybody else who works like that? And they say, oh, yes, everybody else. The real estate people sell the building. All the other people work with percentages. We work with flat fees. And so you think, well, if it works for them, why doesn't it work for you? And they say, well, so the things that hold us back, they are deep assumptions, and they are often emotional assumptions. They are not rational assumptions. And so in my workshops and in the interactive lectures, that's all we do. We try to surface assumptions and try to show that they're actually quite absurd most of the time, and that they only work in your field, and the field next door thinks does it in a completely different way. One more, and then because then you can keep going. Pitching, for example. There's certain fields where you have to pitch. So you have to actually do work which you're not getting paid for, go into a competition, and you lose some and you win some. But a lot of the time it's very frustrating because you're just being added to the pitch round and you're not going to win. They've already decided who they want, and they just need to fill the numbers. And of course, there are systems where, you get a bit of money for the work you've done for the pitch or something like that. But there's lots of interactions between people and between organizations where there's no pitching. I mean, when you go and buy a new car, you don't say to the car dealers, well, why don't you all pitch me a car? Tell me why it's good. Let me drive in it for a while. And then when I've driven all the different cars and made you do a lot of work, then I think I might decide which one I want. The car dealers would say, no, that's not how we work. This is the price. And if you want it, you want it. And if not, not. So if you are in a pitching business, why? What made it a pitching business? Why is that acceptable? Why is it acceptable for you to do a lot of work that you don't get paid for? What happens to all the designs of the pitches that you lose? Is there a kind of a book of unrealized projects or something like that? So we're going into fair detail, but these are the kinds of things I encounter when I work with different fields, and I encounter people who are very professional, very driven. And yet they have such blind spots. And sometimes the blind spots are personal, but more often they're blind spots of their whole organization or their whole field. And there's reasons why these blind spots exists. But if you suffer from these blind spots, it's worth looking into them and having a new perspective.
We all have blind spots. And I think it's not only individual blind spots, but it's collective blind spots. And these collective blind spots can be actually embedded and enshrined in process and policy and artifact and document, and then become sort of the dogma of an organization. I'm curious, and the question of the podcast is, can you share a strategy or tactic, perhaps to simplify something, but has enabled your success or success of people near you? One of the things you said quite a while ago was it is possible to work less and have massive profits in some cases. That might have perked up some people's ears that are listening. But as far as again, coming back to the topic of reframing or realizing that maybe the market is much more abundant and there's many more possibilities that you're not seeing. What can someone do? What do you advise on where could someone start?
Well, I love that question. And I think you asking me this question has made me think about what is the simplest way to say this. And I would say most of the things we do, most of the assumptions we work on are wrong. I wouldn't say all of them, but most of them, a majority of them. So imagine that the work you do, the life that you live, you're doing it with one hand tied behind your back and hopscotching on one foot. That's kind of our normal lives. Because we've taken a lot of the thinking system from the culture, from the history and stuff. Anyway, just look at your assumptions. Why do you do things a certain way? And then question them. And you can question them by saying, what if I stop believing this? The method we use in reframing is, what if I believe the extreme opposite? And that sounds completely silly. Why would the extreme opposite be interesting? But I can give you a couple of examples why you come up with funny stuff. And then just experiment with trying with a new way. So I think there was a slogan for a movie. Everything. Oh yeah, the Mozart movie. Everything you've heard is true, which was a wonderful slogan for the Amadeus movie. I would change it. Everything you do is based on the wrong assumptions. Most things you do is based on the wrong assumptions. So you can start anywhere, and then you say, well, that doesn't help me because where would I want to start? Well, start with the stuff that's the most painful. I heard a nice reframe about pain the other day. Somebody said pain is actually a signal that you need to change. Mm-hmm. If you have a headache, it's a signal that you're doing something wrong with your body. If your knee starts to ache, there's some way you're using your leg in the wrong way. So what is the function of pain in physical pain? Well, the function of physical pain is to make a signal, set this, we can't keep going like this, we have to make a change. And I think the function of emotional pain, the function of frustration, the function of being exhausted at work, the function of not enjoying your work, basically anytime there's something negative, ask yourself, why am I doing it this way? And that it can range from the really small things to the really large things. Mm. But the simplicity hack is most of what we do for the wrong reasons, the wrong assumptions. Change them and experiment. That's it. Yeah. That's all there is.
Well, you touched inadvertently on maybe a core theme of my life journey the last 5 years or so, which is actually to change my perspective on discomfort or contrast or frustration, that without discomfort in life and being frustrated and expectations not being met, there's no way I would be able to refine my desires, refine my expectations, or why did that hurt? And sometimes things are emotionally painful without knowing. The elephant in the rider is oftentimes mentioned because a lot of this is completely subconscious. This is stuff that's just going on. And I think there's an elephant in rider, meaning that 95% of your decision-making and your paradigm is subconscious. And I believe in organizations, it's the same thing, because these things are just enshrined over time and no one really knows why. But there's a lot of people really suffering, because they can't get this elephant to go left, and the elephant's walking to this proverbial cliff, and they just put more hours in. I love it. There's just today with my organization, I was involved in a feedback where actual end users were interviewed and the insights were coming back. And it didn't result in an argument, but there was heat. I felt heat in the room about, do we follow what the user wants? And this was just literally do we follow what the user wants or what the business commercial dimension needs? And the volume of the voices went up and the talking over each other went up, and we didn't finish the whole meeting. So they said, we need to keep meeting. And I just raised my hand and said, well, can we please have a moment in between and discuss why did that heat happen? Can we talk about how to have that conversation before we just start maybe throwing coconuts at each other or something like that? So that's a little mini reframing. But there's so many just deep assumptions we make. Yeah, and you're confronting me that most of them are wrong. I'm like, well, wait, that doesn't make me feel really happy because I thought I was in control here. I thought I had my shit together. So,
well, I'll reframe that's the kind of abundance story. The abundance story is we are such successful apes. We're such successful species that we can afford to do most of the stuff wrong and still be quite successful. It's a bit like the company selling sugar water. Once you can sell the sugar water at that price, basically, anything else you do with the company will probably make it work. Because you've got the key thing. You do that right. And the unfortunate thing is, if we talk about the kind of I would say the more overall view I've gotten from running a lot of these workshops and a lot of these lectures, is that there are things which have to do with the place we have in history. In 2022, we're at the beginning of the 21st century. There's this kind of neoliberal ideology, if you will, but there's capitalist consumption ideology, which I think also has lots of good sides. I'm not critical of it. I believe in business. I believe in the power of business to shape the future and change the world. And yet we found ourselves in this situation where we have collective blind spots, and they have to do with the amount of work, with how we create wealth, with how we still live on this scarcity idea that in order for me to enjoy wealth, I must make sure that you don't have as much as I do or less. Whereas the opportunities to make, and I know it's cliche, but win-win scenarios or win-win-win-win, you're always looking for that. I believe that in almost all cases, there is a win-win-win scenario. And for example, and it becomes very practical. If you're trying to sell a service as a freelancer or as a small organization, and you're starting having this discussion about price, you're having the wrong discussion. The discussion shouldn't be about price. It should be about what can your service or your product do for the other. You want to have a situation where they're getting a deal and they're saying, God, this is the best deal. I can't believe how cheap this is. It's exactly what we need, and it's such a bargain. And where you think, this is great, I'm getting paid so much for this that I can work less. I don't need to exhaust myself to make ends meet. And I think that possibility is almost always present. And so if you're in a situation where you're thinking, I'm going to sell it for this price, but this is really scraping by, and they think, well, I'll pay this, but this is actually a bit further than I wanted to go, you have a lose-lose. And so the question, before you then go into that negotiation, see where's the win-win. And to go to your situation where you talk about users in the company, I think there is dilemmas are fake. There is a scenario where something the users want to say, something the company wants to do actually aligns, and that's what you're looking for. And if you get caught into us versus them, etc., you're in the wrong movie. You're in the wrong scenario. So how do you get yourself out of that scenario?
Yeah, what I felt it was sort of a brinkmanship was forming where it had to be one or the other, and I was like, we're coming to that conclusion really fast here. There must be many, many, many shades of gray. So, Karim, I'm curious. You're so passionate about this, and I would plug your podcast Cornucopia again. Also in the show notes, you've written a couple books were about reframing and abundance. I love your approach on abundance because in my sort of techno-optimist world, oftentimes abundance is we're going to overcome everything with technology, and you have a very human, historical, sort of empathetic approach to this that was like, this is like kind of hard to argue with some of these points because they're extremely well thought through. Why? Meaning, what happened in your life that triggered this type of thinking? Like was that some sort of overcoming some sort of challenge or problem yourself, or how did you choose to continue unpacking this topic of reframing and abundance?
Well, yeah, thanks for the question. The interesting thing is that reframing as a technique actually came from the kind of philosophical thinking I was doing about scarcity and abundance. So sometimes people think I did reframing first and then I started reframing scarcity to abundance, but actually the scarcity to abundance reframe came first. And when I was writing that book, the editor was saying every chapter you present me with the situation and then you somehow do a kind of magical thing. I think you're manipulating me, but at the end of the chapter, I think something different from when I started reading the chapter. And I said, yeah, no, that's on purpose. We all believe this. We all believe that there's overpopulation. We all believe there's too much this, there's too much that. And we then tend to all believe that the solution is doing less, less bad stuff. Let's push back, let's consume less, let's do. And that's become its own ideology. And I think that's completely wrong. I think it's actually quite a dangerous thing to think, because the solution to doing the wrong thing is not doing less of the wrong thing, is doing the right thing, doing the better thing. And there's so many options to do the better things. And we know a lot of them. Technology, we have the technology to do it. We have the organizations to do it. Perhaps some things you could do less in your life, but certainly don't tell other people to do less. If you're happy with doing less, then that's fine. But I don't think you should force other people to do less. But in my lifetime, it came at that time when I stopped being an academic philosopher, when I got involved in those projects. And I was actually an ecological philosopher, or a friend who's an ecological philosopher asked me to write about this. And this was when the ecological thinking 25 years ago, really started taking off. And I said, we're running out of everything, so we must cut back, and everything is scarce. And I also got interested in economic thinking. And at that time, I thought, well, the more I looked into it, over a period of a couple of years, say, I thought, but the argument's wrong. I fell for this. I'm now saying things which, if I start analyzing them for myself, if I look at the assumptions underlying the thing that I'm writing, I'm wrong. It's not. Life is abundant. Life itself is an abundant energy. It's always been that way. Nature is abundant. Growth is incredibly natural. The things I discuss in the podcast. The logical thing for us is to thrive as human beings. And yes, there are setbacks. Pandemics are serious setbacks if we don't know what's trying to kill us in terms of a virus or trying to make us sick. Earthquakes, natural disasters. War, that's a human-made thing, and there's been a lot of war in the history of humankind. So yes, there are things that keep pulling us back, but the normal thing in life is to create lots of good stuff, lots of wealth, lots of joy, lots of humor, lots of love, and those are all the positive sides. And unless you start thinking that I'm completely positive, well, there is the problem that we're mortal. There is death. There is loss. Life is also letting go of stuff all the time.
Is that a problem? I don't know. That's what...
Well, it. I don't think it's a problem, but it makes life. It makes life very valuable, but it also makes it vulnerable to a certain extent. People can have accidents. People can develop nasty diseases, and sometimes when people say you're so optimistic, you always think things are going to shine and be bright, and that's not exactly what I think. I think there's sad times in your life, there's happy times in your life, there is a whole gamut of experiences, and that's how it should be. I think that's the kind of life that's interesting to live. That's a good experience of life, and that's a good experience of our species. We've created civilizations. We're creating a history of the human species. You think big in that sense. What are we trying to achieve as human beings? So they're very broad questions, and so that shift from we understand the world through a frame of scarcity, and the scarcity thinkers, I think, are in the majority. I would say 90% is scarcity thinking at the moment. We have dystopias. All the Hollywood films are about, the end of the earth and the last surviving this and that. And so, we have that story. We like scaring ourselves with this story of global disaster. And yet, it's quite difficult to think positively. You say you're a techno-optimist. I love techno-optimists. Peter Diamandis has a book on abundance where he shows all the exponential growth thinking. Of course, what we've seen in our lifetimes with the internet and this enormous content that it's given us, all kinds of quality. Of course, it's democratized creativity. It's democratized, having a message and sending it out there. It's broadened the group of people who can play enormously by a factor of 100, by a factor of 1,000, 10,000. And we're living through that enormous change.
I think Peter Diamandis is exactly who I was referring to, and having experienced him at Singularity University back in 2011. And what I was confronted with your thinking is, and again, plugging the podcast as a cornucopia as a way to consume that, is it started with a self-reflection, and maybe challenging some of those assumptions, as opposed to assuming that there's threat or assuming there's scarcity, and then therefore you can achieve that through abundance, through technology. So, Karim, I believe people who've experienced your books, your workshops, you're lecturing at Think, there must be people who are open to having some lectures and advice and coaching. I think in this time of just craziness in the market, with companies to reflect on some of their deeply held assumptions, I think would only be healthy. Your links to your website, which then shows your books and other things, is in the show notes. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave people with before we wrap up as a closing point? Because I've been really enjoying this journey, and I'm like, man, I don't want this to stop. But all good things have to come and do an end, at least in podcast land. Maybe not in the abundance.
Absolutely.
Of humanity.
Let's wrap it up. There's a couple of things. One, I'm actually very much into this kind of generosity and open sharing. So thank you for mentioning all the places they can find my work. But it includes, there's online courses. They're on a platform, but they're free. So everything all the stuff that's in my workshop, people say, don't tell this to prospective clients because they're not going to hire you if they see that all the stuff's out there for free. But you almost get the same experience. I really believe that that's the power of abundance and the power of the internet. And anybody who wants to get me live can pay for it, but anybody who wants to get me recorded and will get the same content. And sometimes I get emails from people from different parts of the world who would never have the budget to organize anything, and they've gone off and run off with it. And that makes me deeply, deeply happy. And again, we have the infrastructure that we can put stuff online, and people can, if they make a bit of an effort, they can find their way to it. So if you're interested in any of the stuff, go and look at some of the little clips, and then you can see how, and it's completely DIY. You could do the whole thing yourself, and the more power to you, and use the material. You can show it on a screen. It's all what's it called? Creative Commons type licensing. I believe in sharing material. So that's one thing. I think perhaps I'd like to conclude with, on what levels could we reframe? I think when you reframe something personally, those are the kind of scripts that you've had from childhood. So they could be things like, I must always do my best. Or if I work really hard, then I'm a good boy or a good girl. There's a kind of little psychological story that you believe in. And of course, when you go and do therapy or you get a coach, you will start examining these stories. But in your personal lives, there is deeply held beliefs which can help you, but they can also hurt you. I think perfectionism is something I've struggled with. I like to do things 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 or 10 out of 10, but 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 every time. And I've really had to learn that most things, sending an email, checking something, there's so many things that just need to be done 6 out of 10. They just need to be done pass. And nobody expects them to be done well, but they just want to have them done. And any of the energy you expend to make it an 8 out of 10 is completely wasted. So you've got to realize that you are wasting energy right, left, and center because of this kind of stupid idea that you want everything to be perfect, which is a very and if you're working in a field where everybody is perfectionistic, then you're gonna face a lot more of that. So there's deeply held beliefs in your own personal lives. Then in terms of companies, there's deeply held beliefs you have about your customers, about what they're willing to spend, that you have about the stakeholders, whether they be happy or not. There's always deeply held beliefs you have about the regulators. All the companies I work with, they always have a scapegoat. We'd like to do this, but because of the regulators, we're not allowed to do this. When you talk to the regulators, they say, we're not there to police them. We're there to help them be the best that they can be. We're on your side. Go and talk to the regulators in your industry, and whether it's about pollution or about electricity or about pricing or about consumer protection, you're a team, and that's the reframe. This is not you fighting a strict father figure or something like that. So there's in companies, we're leaving a lot on the table. And if we just had if we were going to the gym and trying to expend as much energy as possible and be happy with it, it wouldn't be a problem. Let's make a lot of products and spend a lot of time doing unnecessary stuff and everybody's happy. But we are facing crises. We face an ecological crisis, and we face, I think, a poverty crisis globally. Still, there's far too many people who are still poor. There's far too many people who, even in rich countries, find it very hard to make a living and live a life of dignity and opportunity and choices. And if we were just keeping our head above water, and some people would make it and some people not, we'd say, okay, well, that's just the way life is. But the sad thing is that we're capable of creating enormous amounts of value and wealth, and yet we don't. And then it becomes a little bit stupid, or it becomes a little bit where you say, a little bit where you would feel a little bit ashamed and say, I think we can do better than that. So on that level, I think the contribution of companies could do that. And I think finally on the global level, what's the story of humanity that we want to believe in? What is the effect that we want to have in the future? We will shape the future, right? One way or the other. And so realizing that we're in charge of shaping the future gives us great responsibility, because this is the story of the human race, and now we're in charge. We know how DNA works. We know how the atom works. We can change the climate. This is the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the age where the humans determine what the geological structure of the planet is. This is where we got. This is the story of our lifetimes. And yet, well, we've been put in charge, so let's rise to the occasion. It's wonderful. We've been given the keys to understanding how life works, to the atom works. Let's play with it. This is my favorite philosopher, Michel Serres. He has this is the best time to be alive. This is in many respects, this is a time of amazing opportunity, and not just financial. If you want financial, but in terms of ideas, in terms of things you can do. Ideas
and possibility and creativity. So Karim, oftentimes I end with a quote about simplicity, meaning like, well, if your business was simple, what would it look like? But I'm going to adapt that as a final comment that, in challenging this stupidity. And if your business could be just a little bit better, if your business could be performing and creating just a little bit more value, what would that look like? So let's just leave people with that. If you can do this better, what would that look like? Karim Benammar, thank you so much. I've absolutely enjoyed this, and I look forward to our next interaction.
Great, Chris. Thank you very much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Download the Simplicity Toolkit from Ebullient.com to discover the power of the Simplicity Scan and Sprint. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite player.